friends, welcome to Sewing Club. Today we are learning the basics of sewing. What you need for this session is a pair of scissors, your thread, and pins and needles. All right, let's get started. All right, let's start with vocabulary. We have thread, fabric scissors. These are not paper scissors. This is a pin cushion. If you don't have a pin cushion, you can use a little square of fabric like I did here. And here we have needles, straight pins with plastic heads, and a safety pin. So the first thing we're going to learn is how to use a straight pin. You need pins and 2 pieces of fabric. You're going to lay your fabric together with the edges nice and evenly spaced. If that's what you're doing, you're gonna take your pin and you're gonna stick it straight through both layers of fabric. Should come out the other side. You're gonna lay it flat against your fabric and then poke it back through to the front. You know you've done it right when you see the head of the pin, the pointy end on the top side, and on the back you see just a little bit of the middle of the shaft of the pin. What you don't wanna do is stick your pin in like this, and then you've got this pointy end sticking out. And you're gonna do that all the way across the edge of your fabric. Now, you wanna make sure you use enough pins. If your fabric looks like this, you haven't used enough pins. This is gonna slip around and not be easy to pin. On the other side, you don't need this many pins. You need one every 3 centimeters or so, depending on what fabric you're using and what you're working on. All right, friends, the next thing we're gonna do today is learn how to thread your needle. So, I have a needle here. It's got a little hole at the top for the thread, that's called the eye, and the long part here is called the shaft. You're gonna take your needle in one hand and then find your thread. One little tip, don't leave your thread on the table like this and pull, because it's gonna bounce everywhere and it's gonna fall off and annoy you. So what you're gonna do instead is set your needle or your thread up like this, pull upwards. You can get all the thread off that you need and your thread spool isn't gonna roll everywhere. All right, so you're gonna find the end of your thread. If it's kind of frayed, just chop off a little bit to make a nice, clean cut at the end. What I do is I hold it with my finger and my thumb, about 1 centimeter, a little less from the end, and I hold it still, and then I take my needle and I put the eye over the end of the thread. I move the needle instead of the thread. Might take you a couple times. When you do have it, you pull it through. So what we want to do is have 2 strands of thread on our needle to make it nice and strong. So I'm gonna just keep pulling until I've got 2 strands there, and we want to pull so it's about the length of your arm. So from your wrist to your armpit. The reason you want this length is because any shorter than this and you're gonna be changing your thread every 10 seconds and it's gonna drive you nuts. Or if it's too long, it's gonna get really tangled really quickly. So once you've got the ends and you've snipped the end on your thread, you're going to take the ends between your finger and your thumb and you're gonna gently wrap this around about 3 times. You don't want it so tight that it's cutting off the circulation, but you also don't want it so loose that it's hanging off on a loop. So with your finger and your thumb, you're going to roll these threads back and forth on your finger so they sort of get all mixed up, and you can see I'm using this finger on this side if I need to. When you've got them sort of mixed up, you're gonna roll it right off the end and you're gonna have something that looks kind of like this. I like to call it a wreath. Kind of looks like a wreath that you would hang on your door. Okay, all wrapped up, sort of tangled a little bit in a circle. With your finger and your thumb, you're gonna hold your thread just above your little wreath and you're gonna slide down. And you're gonna see it's gonna get all tangled up and make a mess. That's good, that's what we want. Eventually, your finger's gonna stop and it's gonna make a knot that kind of looks like a bug. It's kind of like wings. If this doesn't happen the first time, try again. So we are ready to sew with our threaded needle and our knot. Okay friends, we are ready to sew. We have our fabric pinned, we have our needle threaded and knotted and in the pin cushion and ready to go. My fabric is pinned with the edges nice and neatly. I've got 3 pins nicely spaced apart. We're ready. If you're right-handed, you're going to take the needle in your right hand and start on the right side. If you are left-handed, you'll start on the left. What you can do if you'd like to hide your little knot is go in between the 2 layers of fabric, poke your needle through, and pull. You're going to pull all the way till the knot stops it. It's sort of hiding there. So we're just going to tuck it in and hold this closed. Now, what you're going to do is take your needle and you're going to go on the same side your thread came out. You're going to move over a couple of millimeters and stick your needle in all the way through to the back, and you're going to pull. This is called a running stitch. It's a sort of in and out stitch. This is awesome. I've already have a little knot. When you're sewing, you're often going to get little tangles like this. If I pull, it's not going to go through. Don't panic. This is not a huge deal. All you need to do at this point is pull this back out a little bit, tug the fabric and the thread, and usually the knot comes out, and then you can slide it. Great. I'm quite tangled over here. Gracious. Okay. So I'm looking at the side that my thread is coming out. It's on the back side, or we'll say the back side for now. You're going to go over a couple of millimeters. You're going to stick it in and pull it through. Again, I've got a little knot. I'm going to do a little tug. Your thread probably won't do this as much as mine does. I'm using a really thick embroidery thread so that you can see it well on the video. When you're stitching, you want your stitches to be small and even and neat. The smaller and more even that your stitches are, the stronger your piece will be. My thread's really giving me a hard time today. There. So you're always going in and out, always making sure that you look what side your thread is coming out. What happens to a lot of students when they start sewing is they keep going and then they stop paying attention because they're getting comfortable, and instead of putting their needle in this side, you do this and put it in the back again. What's going to happen when I pull this? I'm going to get a loop. We don't want that. So make sure you're always going to the side. When you get to the end of your seam or you're starting to run out of thread, you'll need to tie off. When you get to about this much thread left, you need to tie off at the end and rethread your needle, even if you're in the middle of a seam. The reason is if you wait till you only have this much thread left, you're not going to be able to tie off properly and your seam will probably come apart. If you just chop your thread off here, your seam is going to come apart and your whole project will fall apart. What you need to do to make sure that this stays is do a couple of stitches in the same spot and tie a couple knots. So what I do is I go in and out the same spot and do 3 stitches. But before I finish this stitch, I'm going to come back to this side and I'm going to put my needle through the loops, and that's going to tie a little knot, and I'm going to pull it tight on both sides. If you don't want to go all the way through, you can do a little stitch like this where you go into the back and kind of like using a straight pin. You put your needle alongside the fabric and come back out right away. Before you finish that little loop, you put your needle through and you tie a knot. I'm going to do that 3 or 4 times. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. When you're satisfied, you're going to take your scissors and trim as close as you can to the knot without cutting anything important. So don't cut any loops, don't cut your fabric. Right, and that's done. You're probably thinking now, Madame, what happens though if I make a mistake? This is the cool thing about sewing. It's almost never permanent. You can always take things out. I'd like you to introduce you to your new best friend. This is called a seam ripper. This is basically your sewing eraser. If you don't have a seam ripper, you can use a pin as long as you're careful and don't poke yourself. So, let's say that you've done a seam and you're not really happy with it. Your stitches are really big, they're not very even. You know this isn't going to be very strong. What you can do is chop off your needle, grab the end with the knot, and you should be able to pull your thread right out in one piece. Super easy. If that's not gonna work, you can do this. If you've accidentally done one of these little loops, you've actually done a whip stitch. These are straight stitches, this is a whip stitch. These are really great in other situations, but not here. If you try to pull your thread out from the knot, you're not going to be able to because of that loop. It's not going to go. So what you need to do is use your seam ripper. Basically what you do is you put the pointy end under your stitch and you wiggle it out. And you wiggle it all the way back to where you need it to. You can use anything that's sort of skinny and pointy. Don't use anything that'll mark your fabric, so don't use a pen or a pencil. It's not a good idea. If you're looking to find one of these somewhere, it's called a seam ripper, and a lot of dollar store sewing kits will have them. If you rip your thread, that's okay too. Here we go, now I can take up this little loop, my little accidental whip stitch. And from here, I can probably just pull my knot, and I'm done. So those are 2 ways to fix your mistake if you're not happy with your seam. All right, you have all of the basics. You are ready to go and sew your first project. If you're feeling confident, you can try the bookmark, which is the next video coming. Have fun.